Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Tengku Zafran Shah bin Tengku Iskandar Zulkarnain, and today I would like to present to you my individual assignment for code ITT440 network programming. So my title for individual assignment is Socket Programming in C versus Python. So this is my background. My full name is Tengku Zafran Shah bin Tengku Iskandar Zulkarnain. My student ID is 20228422268, and I am from group M3CS2554A. So what is a socket? Socket is a low-level endpoint of communication between two devices or programs in a network. Imagine two persons communicating by sending and receiving messages. This way, their PCs become the endpoint of communication or sockets. Common networking protocol that rely on sockets to make connection are HTTP and FTP. So, what are types of socket? First, we have stream socket or sock_stream, which is utilize TCP protocol. It is a reliable delivery, a connection-oriented and bidirectional, meaning that the sockets can receive and send message at the same time. Next, we have datagram socket or sock_dgram that utilize UDP protocol, which is an unreliable delivery and also connectionless, and also send and receive messages or data separately. So next, what is client-server? Client-server is a relationship in which one program, the client, requests a service or resource from another program, which is the server. For example, of computer application that use the client server are model such as email, network printing, and the World Wide Web, which is www. Next, how does client and server work? So this is the diagram that shows the overall process of server and client. First, both server and client will create socket, and then which is binding the IP address and port number to the socket, and then the server will then listen for a request. After the client initiate the request, the server will accept the request, and also the client will establish the connection, and then the client will then write the request for any data or messages, and the server will read the data or messages received from client, and then corresponding to the data or messages, the server will then write back the response for the request. And then after they both receive the required data, both of the socket will then be closed. Next, this is the socket command in C. First, we have integer s equal to socket, domain type and protocol, which is creating the socket with specified domain type, UDP or TCP, and protocol value. Then we have integer status equal to bind, sock ID, address port, and size. This is for binding the socket with its IP address and its port number. But if we use sock_dgram, which is the UDP datagram, bind is needed if receiving message only. Then we have integer status equal to listen with sock and q len as the parameter, which is waiting for client to approach server to make connection. The value will be 0 if listening and -1 if an error occur. Then we have integer s equal to accept with sock name and name length as the parameter, which is waiting for connection before returning. Then we have integer status equal to connect with sock name and name length as the parameter. This function is to accept request to establish connection with 0 if successful and -1 if otherwise. Then lastly, we have status equal to close, which is to close the socket. Then we have the socket commands in Python. We have socket.socket, which is to create the socket. Then we have bind with host and port as the parameter, which is also the same as before, binding the socket with its IP address and port number. Then we have accept, accepting connection, connect to establish connection, send to send messages, listen to listening or waiting for other computer to send messages or requests. Then we have receive, to decode the received messages into its system, and lastly we have close, which is the same as command in C to close the socket after the session is completed. So let's start coding. In conclusion, which language is better for socket programming? Is it C or Python? The answer is, both languages are good for socket programming, but they bring different outcome and approach when being used by the programmer themselves. There is no disadvantage of using either of the language. For example, the advantage of using C, even though it is more detail-oriented and much easier to grasp the fundamental of socket programming, it takes more line of code when coding. Meanwhile, the advantage of using Python is it takes lesser line of code when coding. Other than that, it is easier to comprehend and understand as it uses simpler command. So there is no disadvantage of using both languages, and you can choose whether you want to use C or Python to start socket programming. That's all from me. Thank you for listening. Bye bye.